Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, so my name's Monique Froom, and today my session is on pre-tests, so the why and how. So we've already had a bit of an introduction about me, but I just wanted to go back over that one again. So I am a second year teacher at Palm Beach Currumbin State High School. So in my role, I am teaching Year 7, so English, Humanities is also a literacy support class known as LAN. And I'm also teaching 12 Com and 12 English OP. So I have a wide variety of classes that I teach, but the one thing that most of my classes have in common is that they are all at low literacy. And also I coordinate Year 7 English. So within my role, I've had to rewrite a lot of the pre-tests, and that's what we're going to be learning about today. So I do have my objectives up on the screen. So what I wanted to try and cover today within 20 minutes, because it is such a short time. So to understand literacy skills and why these are important and why these need to be differentiated. To understand what actually a pre-test is and how we can create a pre-test to target skills. So using evidence from our pre-tests to inform our practice, and then how we can create some of our activities to differentiate our literacy skills within our classroom. All right, so originally this was meant to be a lot smaller group, so I did have a pre-test that I was going to give you guys about pre-tests. But what I would like you to do is just write down somewhere on your page what you currently know about pre-tests and how you use them in your classroom, or how you use them to influence your teaching. So even if that's just a sentence, that's okay, because when it comes to professional development, I always like to write down at the start anyway some of the things that I thought coming into the session, so then when I come to reflecting afterwards, I could integrate what I've learned into my teaching and think about it that way. All right, I'm going to move on just in the interests of time. So our responsibility as teachers. So I've taken all of this information from the EQ strategic plan that they've released earlier this year. So this is what we're looking for in the next 4 years in schooling in Education Queensland. So it says that as teachers, we are told that we are responsible to engage, retain and re-engage young people in learning in order for them to achieve success in the classroom. So the reason why we do this is that it helps them to build pathways to their future education, training and work. What has been identified by EQ is that literacy is one of those important skills that is key to setting them up for changing the world, but it's something that we're still not doing. Teaching literacy skills, we're not doing that as well as what it could be, which is why it's one of our focuses and why these skills actually need to be differentiated in the classroom. So if we look at our AITSL standards, so I know a lot of people are, about to finish uni or are in their first year. I did present this to my pedagogy coach beforehand as well, so she did suggest that this would be really good to have in there as well. But our first standard is to know students and how they learn. So if we are looking at it from the perspective of a pre-test, it is a tool to gain evidence about who our students are and what they do or don't know, so that can then inform our other standards, such as how to teach it in a way that is going to be meaningful for our students. So it's going to help us in having more effective teaching. And I also like to use tests as a way of not only assessing what my students know throughout at the start of the unit, but I might reintroduce, depending on what the test is, whilst I'm teaching as well, to track their progress, but also at the end, after the assessment, or if the assessment is really similar to the pre-test, so I can see what they have actually learned. So it's one really good way of mapping and checking your data as you're going and looking at the progress that your students are making, or decide where you need to go from there. Say 3 weeks into a unit, something isn't going right, so you need to reevaluate what you are teaching. So standard 1, so know your students. So students come into your classroom with a variety of different skill sets and have a variety of different literacy abilities. So for instance, in my Year 7 class, you can't really assume that all students come in with the literacy ability of a Year 7 student. I've got quite a lot of my students who are working at Year 3, 4 level, and I've also got a few students who are working at Year 9 and 10. So we need to accommodate for a variety of different learners just in that one classroom alone. So an effective teacher focuses on the learning needs of all students, so making sure that they're giving them activities and things that they can do at each individual level. So if we look at our assessments, so they are designed to assess skills, so whether that be justify, create, persuade, so they're assessing the skills that students have learnt throughout that unit. So the content knowledge that students are learning throughout the unit isn't necessarily being assessed, it's through their skills that they're demonstrating what they have learnt. So I know it's a bit confusing, but if I think back to one of the units that I taught earlier this year, it was on Ned Kelly, and they got given a stimulus in unseen exam conditions, and they had to write a story about Ned Kelly from an alternative perspective. So we're not necessarily assessing what they know about Ned Kelly, but how they can manipulate that information that they have learnt to create a narrative. So the skills being there, being able to, write that narrative, description, perspective, all those types of things. So if a student doesn't know how to write their assessment, then how are they actually going to be able to demonstrate the knowledge that they have acquired? So there's a lot of my students, particularly the ones that are quite level, they can articulate everything that they have learnt, but when it comes to assessment, we need something written in English, depending on what you're teaching. Sometimes it is a speech, but it's that written component that they really need help in supporting to be able to achieve that success. So how do you actually know a student's literacy ability? So you could look at your NAPLAN data, or if your schools, I think most schools do PATA, so the reading comprehension, but I know when I was a beginning teacher, these were the things that I was expected to access and know how to analyse, but it's something that I really struggle with and at times still do, especially when you go into NAPLAN and you can pull up for each individual student in your class questions that they have got right and what they have gotten wrong and what that actually means and how you can help them in your classroom. So this is why I tend to rely on pre-test quite a lot to get to inform my practice. So if you don't know what a pre-test is, so it's a test that you give your students at the beginning of your unit. So it's designed to assess the skills that they are going to be learning or need to be able to demonstrate throughout the unit and in their assessment piece. So it provides an indication of what students can and can't do by themselves, or what they do or what they don't already know. So it's a really good indicator about where your students are starting at coming into this particular unit. And then it's also really good for the teacher, as it provides insights on what skills you really need focus on in that particular unit, but also some of the skills that you don't need to dedicate that much time to. So when it comes to creating a pre-test, so this is something that I've had to do in my role as a course coordinator, but you might need to do that for yourselves for your own classes as well, is I always go back to the assessment item, look at the genre and look at the criteria sheet and looking at the skills that students actually need to be able to demonstrate. So in my role, a lot of the pre-tests that students have been doing previously have been just content-based. So for example, if we think about that Ned Kelly unit I was explaining beforehand, their pre-test was a reading comprehension exam on Ned Kelly. And whilst reading comprehension is a skill that a lot of students need, it's not necessarily relevant or going to help them in preparing for an unseen narrative exam. And it's also not going to provide you with any information about how you're going to help your students get to that end product. So the skills that you put in your pre-test should be the skills that is relevant for that exam, and then should be the focus of your differentiation in the teaching within your classroom. So I've decided to show you an example of a pre-test that I did. So this was the Year 7 memoir unit. So the reason why I've chosen this one is that it's occurred in term 3. So after I've already taught my narrative unit, and I also know a lot about my students, and it's also, I've got a lot of things that I was looking for in this pre-test, so also as a way of tracking their progress. So my pre-test looked something very similar to this. So I would have handed it out because a lot of my kids like to write and annotate all over their pre-tests. So I would have, for this particular unit, gone over the genre of what a memoir is, just because a memoir is a really interesting word that a lot of them probably would have freaked out about. So vocabulary for a lot of my students that struggle can be the difference if they're going to try an activity or not. So I broke down what a memoir was, and then I told my students that I'd like them to pick a memory. So it could be a memory that they're familiar with, it could be made up, I have no idea if it's true or not, and I wanted them to have a go at writing the memoir. So Freytag's pyramid is something that they've already seen, and in my kind of summary of what a memoir was, I would have gone over how we need to be focusing on thoughts, feelings, and reflection. So that was something that I would have been looking for. So what skills was I looking for? So I've got quite a lot, because like I said, I was doing a pretty in-depth pretest. When you're creating a pretest, you could just look at one specific skill. You don't have to focus on a whole range of different things. So I was looking at their text structure. So we've already done something very similar, how well they've picked up on that. I was looking at their cohesion and sequencing of ideas. So their ability to use description. So a lot of my students in my class, especially from the narrative, weren't using any figurative language or any just description at all. It was all then this happened and this happened. So I wanted to see if they had improved or not from that one. So their ability to reflect, because that is key. And then finally, if they use punctuation or not. And for my higher level students, particularly looking at if they'd use punctuation for effect, is that something else that we had been going on about in class. So I know that that looks like there is a lot of things that I was looking for, but I honestly don't spend a lot of time looking at these pre-tests. So what I generally do is I only read them once, and I come up with like a little of my own criteria sheet, and I tick if they have done it or if they haven't, or I might write a little comment like they've kind of done it but not really. And this is what's going to influence my groupings for that particular unit, because some genres kids are better at than others, so they might move up and down between different groups. So yeah, and that's how I begin to start differentiating for my class. So I start looking at what kids can and can't do and start assigning them groups based on that. And then I write a list of things that students have demonstrated, so the skills that they have demonstrated. So as you can see, I've just focused on my students working towards C's and my students working towards A's. I tend to have 3 to 4 groups in my class, so the middle groups tend to benefit from instructions either side. But yeah, so for instance, if we look at my students towards C's, a lot of them lacked paragraphing. It was just a block text. Some of them didn't even have a capital letter or full stop. They just kept on writing. Where my students heading towards A's used paragraphs to convey their ideas, but they followed that typical narrative structure. So when we look at the skills that I'm wanting to teach them, so having some more complex structures in there is really going to help them push into that A bracket, such as a flashback or using an extended metaphor. So yeah, this here on the screen is just an example of the skills that I've broken down that I need to focus on to help each group of my students so that they can achieve either that C or hopefully get into that A bracket. And then from there, I've created some activities that I would do as a whole class or what I would break down into groups. I've got a couple of examples that I wanted to show you before. Do I have time? Yep, awesome. So I created this activity particularly for my students working towards C. So this is just storyboarding. So this here really helped my students with being able to articulate what they wanted to put in each paragraph, but also by having that drawing or visual, or a lot of my students actually have laptops, so finding some pictures that are associated with that memory and sticking it in that storyboard really helped them with being able to come up with some ideas to write about, where this benefited my students working towards A's very well because they tend to over-describe or overwrite everything, so they could really focus and narrow down on the specific things that they wanted to convey and wanted to reflect on. Whereas for my students working towards A's, we did a lot of work in class on this idea of a trigger and the 5 senses and how that can be a trigger to go back into that memory and start writing and describing and reflecting from that point. But this worked really well for that middle group actually, because a lot of my students attempted to try and have a go at writing a flashback, so they moved away from that typical genre. So that really helped my a lot of those kids in that middle area really improve for this particular assessment. So when it came to group activities, I'm really lucky that I get a teacher aide for 2 lessons a week. So this is something that I would have given her to work with my students who are working towards C's. So because we were focusing a lot on using figurative language in our writing. A lot of my students really struggle with being able to remember what a simile, what a metaphor, what an idiom actually is, and then they really struggle with being able to put that into their own writing. So what we did is a bit of a brainstorm. So brainstorming everything, all their similes, all the metaphors, all the hyperbole that they could think of to do with happiness, and once they've had those examples in front of them, they found that a lot easier to be able to take and then put into their own writing. Whereas I had about 3 students in my class who are really advanced, so we actually had to go at writing a memoir as an extended metaphor. So what we did is we looked at some metaphors that we could use to convey an idea, such as, happiness is, to be walking on air. So that was our metaphor that we were going to use for that particular activity. Then we brainstormed heaps of associations, words, images that we could use to help build on that idea before we started to practice write. And then I always get them to go back and refine so they've got that clearer, more cohesive idea whilst I then go around to other classes and to check in with what they are doing. All right, anyway, I was originally going to get you guys to have a go at picking your own skill and coming up with your own either whole class or group activity, but we don't have time for that. Yeah, so what I will get you to do, on where I got you to write at the start of the pretest what you already knew about pretests, can I get you to go back and reflect on maybe something that you've learnt or something that you could take away from this PD so that you can then implement in your own practice? Thank you.